Today we are speaking to Mr. Leslie Maasdorp, the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at New Development Bank, also known as the BRIC Bank or the BRICS Bank, formed by some of the emerging economies and developing countries in the world. It's a global multilateral development institution, headquarters in Shanghai, and as part of your objective, you are looking at bringing sustainable finance to global institutions and individuals, primarily in the emerging markets and developing countries. Describe for us the vision for the New Development Bank, or NDB, and its role in addressing global infrastructure needs.
Thank you very much for having me. So, as you've just referenced, the bank was created by the BRICS countries. BRICS comprise of the largest emerging market countries in the world, and started to really cement itself around 2009, almost 15 years old. In fact, the 15th BRICS Summit will take place in South Africa in a few weeks' time. Right. A few years after its creation, these countries felt the need to create an institution to give greater expression of the aspirations of emerging markets. Emerging markets, as you know, is really the story of the last generation. The last 30, 40 years have been defined by the rise of China, growing at double digits for several decades, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil and other large countries. So the bank was created against that backdrop to give bigger voice to emerging markets and to create an institution that will be anchored in the developing countries, because the development context, the sort of priorities of emerging markets are different from the issues facing the developed world. So in 2015, the bank was created. 2015, as you would know, was a very decisive year in with respect to climate change and with respect to the rise of sustainable finance. 2015, September, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. So that was a key moment in 2015. December 2015, the first legally binding global accord called the Paris Agreement was signed. That was the year or the context or the platform on which the New Development Bank was created. So we were really created as sustainable finance became mainstream, if you like. For that reason, the bank has deeply in its DNA, everything about sustainability. So if you look at our strategy today, we have a 40% target for climate finance. So almost half of all of our exposures goes towards climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So the first reason for the formation of the bank was to give expression to the emerging markets. The second one was really to explore where is the possibilities for further reform of the NDB system. For example, we put a great emphasis on local currency financing, meaning developing local capital markets. And then finally, as I just said, creating the conditions for infrastructure that is focused on reducing carbon emissions, meaning sustainable infrastructure.
The New Development Bank is quite nascent in its formation, 8 years old. Apart from the 5 founding members, now you've got new members like Egypt, the UAE, Bangladesh, and Uruguay, and you're looking for more countries to join this institution. Tell us, in terms of globally, the need for sustainable finance, and how is the NDB supporting those needs?
I mean, as you know, there's a massive financing gap in the world today in terms of the demand and the need for massive kind of retrofitting of all of the infrastructure in the world, whether it be new energy systems, new ports, new rail. Every form of infrastructure needs to be retrofitted. So there is a demand for new financial instruments, a demand for new approaches, and the demand for new entities to emerge. So we are just one of those new entities that have come about. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, headquartered here in Beijing, is another new institution that have been created. So to give you a sense of scale, between 2015 and today, the bank has approved $35 billion of new infrastructure in all of the BRICS countries. IIB, headquartered here in Beijing, already approved north of $40 billion of new infrastructure. These two combined, therefore over $75 billion. So you can see how just in the last 8 years, there's been an injection of fresh impetus to meet the financing gap in the emerging markets. We are also living through a period now of looking and exploring where's the scope for further innovation, the scope for new financial instruments, the scope for doing business differently so that we can free up more capital, so that we can lend more. Because multilateral banks, as you know, are very highly rated institutions. We have the lowest cost of capital. However, in a scale, in terms of the business that we conduct every year, we are quite small. There's a demand for new infrastructure in emerging markets alone of north of $1 trillion per annum, and the development banks, the combined annual lending volumes is about 125 million. So we're not even 10% of the requirement. Right. Therefore, there's a need to take a fresh look at what more can we do to fast track and accelerate the process towards net zero.
And talk about the NDB strategy for mobilizing resources and attracting investment for infrastructure project. You're doing it quite differently. You have a focus on leveraging and deploying local currency funding, and also how that will help deepen the individual or the respective country's financial markets.
So as you know, the US dollar represents the largest pools of liquidity in the world. And therefore, because the bank's balance sheet is in dollars or reporting currency is dollars, our capital is in dollars, we have dollar as the principal anchor currency. However, it is not always the most efficient way to conduct your infrastructure investment. Many and most actually of the infrastructure we build has local currency revenues. If you build a power, a wind power, a solar power project, people pay you in the local currency. So if you borrow in, let's say in dollars, and if your currency depreciates, you have to pay back significantly more. So there's a mismatch between the asset and the liability. It is in our interest, therefore, to promote a more efficient form of financing where we both raise in local currency, let's say in renminbi, and on lend in renminbi. We already have deep capital markets in many of the member countries. China has a bond market north of $18 trillion, and there's therefore sufficient depth in this market for us to raise money here. Similarly, there's deep capital markets in South Africa, in Brazil, in India, and so on. So we want to have a target of having at least 30% of our financing come from the local currency markets. And by deepening local currency financing, we are strengthening the financial and capital markets of each of our member countries. As you know, a country cannot develop and become a modern, sophisticated economy without developed financial markets. So we want to play a role to aid and support the evolution of strong domestic markets where pension funds, asset managers, the pools of saving in the economy can be channeled into productive investment.
To date, you have over 100 projects, and as you mentioned, 35 billion raised and invested. Those funds being deployed today among the 9 countries that make up the bank.
So the bank, as you know, was founded by the 5 countries. Most of the approved projects that you have just referenced, or all of the approved projects, $35 billion, are all in the 5 BRICS countries. The new members only joined in the last few years. We are only in the process now of building up a pipeline in Bangladesh, in Egypt, in the new countries to deploy funds. So the 35 billion approval is 100% in Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. India is the largest borrower with around 26% or so. China, second, around 24%. And all of these involve significant infrastructure projects, whether it be construction of the Mumbai Metro in Mumbai that we are co-financing with Asia Development Bank, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. We've got very large renewable energy projects here in China, in Fujian province, offshore wind projects, in Shanghai, rooftop solar projects. So the bank is a significant additional provider of finance for sustainable infrastructure here in China and our other member countries.
Okay. And how are you safeguarding the environmental and social aspect of selecting those projects and in the financing process?
So multilateral development banks, as you know, set very high standards. When it comes to ESG, our standards have also become standardized. meaning we have harmonized our approach to ESG. All the multilateral banks today have a single joint report on climate finance that comes out annually. They started with us around 2021 or 2020. So we set the highest possible standards, and we aim to lift what we call the country systems. In each country, as you know, they have environmental policies, environmental standards. However, there is still very different taxonomies that exist in various countries today. We are still on the path now of full harmonization, if you like. The International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, which was created by the IFRS Foundation, they will become the standard setter over time. They were created about 2 years ago. They've started work, and I think we are now on that journey of having global standards that will become uniform and accepted.
Okay. Tell us about the governance process. The bank is owned by the 5 founding members. In terms of project selection, do they have equal say in what projects get approved and how the funds are deployed? In
that sense, the New Development Bank is quite unique in the sense that the bank has only borrowing members. Most of your development banks, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, Asia Development Bank, World Bank, European Investment Bank, they have 2 categories of shareholders. Non-borrowing members, countries like Singapore, Korea, Germany, France, Canada, United States, and so on. These countries are shareholders. They are significant players in the institution, but they are non-borrowing members. In the case of the New Development Bank, all of our shareholders are also borrowing members. So at one level, their interest is the long-term financial sustainability of the bank. At the same time, they want to borrow as cheaply as possible. They also want to make sure that the interest rates are as high as possible so we can generate income. So there's sort of an inherent potential conflict of interest there. But one can find a balance between these competing objectives. So the decisions of the bank are made also in a unique sense because the bank is equally owned by these 5 countries. But in terms of your question on governance, each of the countries have an equal say. We only in exceptional circumstances would vote on matters. We have a track record of having rich consensus on most substantive issues.
Okay. And right now, you're mainly, the founding members are mainly emerging developing countries, right? Low middle income. UAE is kind of a high income developer.
That's correct.
Are you going to have more members who probably will join but not as borrowing members?
Absolutely. Our aim is to expand in a balanced manner, meaning we will also bring in highly rated countries. But this is a development finance institution, and therefore we will also bring in countries where the credit worthiness is very low, because the development needs typically in those countries are the highest, right? You have large countries in Africa, for example, who have credit ratings that are very much lower than the weighted average rating of our current shareholders. But there's huge demand for infrastructure in those countries. So as we embark on the membership expansion drive, we will seek to do it in a balanced way so that we can preserve the very high credit worthiness of our institution. We have a AA plus credit rating from Standard & Poor and AA from Fitch, which means that we are just one notch in the case of Standard & Poor from AAA, which is the highest possible credit worthiness that you can have. What that does is it gives us the possibility to raise funding at the cheapest possible levels and therefore provide loans at interest rates to our member countries that is very, very competitive to, let's say, the AAA rated peers. It's very important for us to preserve that ability into the future, even when we bring in the countries that are, let's say, not so credit worthy. So we will do this in a manner to ensure that we can pass on that benefit to the new countries that join.
Now, the New Development Bank exists today to serve these emerging markets and developing countries that represent about 40% of the younger population today, and more than 50% of GDP, even surpassing the G20 economies, because they are not properly represented at the international level. But still, collaboration with the traditional NDBs are important for you. And how are you going about it?
Multilateral Development Bank universe is really a collaborative system, if you like. When the bank was started, from day one, when I arrived here in July 2015 in Shanghai, we collaborated very, very closely with the World Bank, with the International Finance Corporation, with Asia Development Bank, European Investment Bank, and so on. These institutions provided ideas, they provided their policies, best practices. So there was a huge amount of lessons we could derive from the historical experience and draw from the best practices of the past. But we built our foundations with the intent to identify what are the next practices, meaning based on the historical lessons we can draw, what are the next practices for the new era we are entering? We're entering an era of big data and artificial intelligence. We're entering an era of sustainable finance. We're entering an era of developing, making use of technology in much more imaginative ways, of Internet of Things, of redesigning infrastructure in ways that was not possible before. So we had this great task of having to identify what would an infrastructure of the future look like? How do you design roads for self-driven cars in the next 10, 15 years? So that was the biggest challenge for us then. But the key point I'm making is that the multilateral development banks are partners in this endeavor. We aim to do more co-financing with these institutions because we are in the same space and there's massive demand for financing of infrastructure, and we can scale what we do if we work together. So the size of the infrastructure gap is so large that we have to work together.
And sustainable finance, climate finance is a global objective when it was first launched. The SDG by the United Nations in 2015. But since then, the world has become very different. Geopolitical tension has increased. Does that mean necessary that the NDB will represent a kind of, although your nature is finance, become a geopolitical, political pole or pact among the emerging countries represented by the founding members?
The New Development Bank, like all other multilateral banks, are financial institutions. We have capital, we make loans, we make credit investment decisions every day. We're not political organizations. We are owned by governments. We take into account the macro risk landscape, the geopolitical global context, but we are not players in that space. We don't operate at a political level. We are banks.
Today, if we look at the example of China, how do you see China's sustainable finance ecosystem industry developing in terms of standards and guidelines from the central bank? China's is committed to peak emission by 2030, but neutrality by 2060, a bit off the Paris Agreement commitment of 2050. How do you see that developing, and how do you see their own policy and guidelines developing?
Very interesting question. I've lived in China now for the past 8 years, and over this period, I've seen the significant acceleration of green finance and creating sustainable capital markets here in China, both in terms of creating an enabling policy environment, creating a legal and regulatory framework that enables the rise of green finance. I've seen the emergence of more leadership coming from the policymakers, especially the People's Bank of China, over this period. So way back in 2016, PBOC, the People's Bank of China, came up with the green bond guidelines, which enabled us in 2016 to issue our first bond as a green bond. So the first capital markets activity of New Development Bank was in the green space. Since then, China was co-chairs in the G20 Green Finance Committee, and they've really played a leadership role in creating an ecosystem that is still kind of under construction today. China has a disproportionate leadership role that it ought to play in the world because it is the largest emitter globally. 27-28% of greenhouse gas emissions come from China. China is the largest exporter in the world. Most of the labor-intensive manufactured goods that the world have today are produced here. For the world to reach the Paris Agreement sort of targets, China has to reach its targets. China, because of the emission intensity of the economy, has no prospect of reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, and therefore it was extended by another 10 years. But reaching peak emissions by 2030, that's only 7 years away, is a significant ask. So the country is probably on the most rapid accelerations of implementing strategies, putting in place new policies, designing new industrial strategies to create the new industries, whether it's the electrical vehicle industry, green hydrogen, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage. All of these new industries are flourishing here in China, early stage still, but there is an enabling legislative and regulatory framework for the growth of these industries. In short, what I'm saying is China is already doing a lot, but it has a huge responsibility to provide further climate leadership.
How is its financial system developing? The financing gap and sustainable finance requirement for China, it's by 2025, it's about 2.3 trillion, and today it's already has got the second largest green bond market in the world, and that will reach about 1 trillion by 2025 as well. How do you see banks stepping up and supporting, enabling that transition?
One of the advantages also that China has is that it has something which no other countries in the West have, which is they have a planning system that is very unique to the Chinese context, meaning that they can set long-term objectives, let's say for the financial sector, because all the leading systemically important banks are state-owned, which means that you're not going to have two banks with different policies from the rest. So it has been able to provide policy leadership in that regard. So when you look at the sustainable green and finance policies of ICBC, Bank of China, China Construction Bank, China Development Bank, all of these institutions, it's aligned. So there is one huge benefit from the very peculiar planning system which you have here, which is very different from the West, where you have democratic governments, mayors and governors of provinces change from time to time. They sometimes change the policy approaches and so on. So China has to take advantage of that unique aspect of its planning system to inject specific targets so that you can sort of see what is the direction of travel, by 2025, where will you reach, and so on. There's clearly evidence of greater collaboration between the EU and China, greater collaboration between the US and China. John Kerry, as you know, is the climate envoy of the United States. He's been here re-injecting momentum into the partnership between China and the United States. Secretary Blinken came here, Secretary Yellen came here, giving further impetus to a kind of a new atmosphere of collaboration, specifically also the climate and sustainable finance agenda. So because of the sheer size of this market, as I said earlier on, this is a $17-18 trillion economy with a bond market larger than the size of the economy. There is a lot that we can learn from this market because it is such a deep capital market from a local currency perspective. The New Development Bank has also been able to pioneer new instruments. We issued here the first SDG bond, Sustainable Development Goal bond, in 2021. And we hope to do more of that. We're looking at potentially issuing blue bonds, and meaning it's more kind of creation of new markets. Then you enable others in the private sector to follow suit. So it's not just about raising green finance and financing our projects. It's also about playing a market leadership role here in China, together with our peers like AIIB, Asia Development Bank, World Bank, and so on.
Okay. What are some potential challenges and risks that the NDB face in achieving its objectives? Right.
I would say one of the key challenges, is the growth path and growth momentum. In order for the bank to really craft a sort of 10-year growth plan, it needs to inject all the significantly new members, because that with it will bring fresh capital. So the bank was very well capitalized with $50 billion of subscribed capital. $10 billion of that is equity, and then $40 billion is callable capital. callable capital is a form of a guarantee which the bank have. But most of our funding, as you know, comes from the bond markets, meaning we issue bonds in the international capital markets in dollars or euro, and then also we issue in the domestic markets of our member countries. We do that on the back of very high credit ratings. So the challenge going forward is to grow in such a manner that we preserve this high credit worthiness, as I mentioned before. Secondly, that we're able to inject fresh capital so we can leverage our capital more going forward. Because if we grow at the rate that we have grown up till now, you will reach the ceiling of your risk limits framework, your leverage ratios and so on. So we need to inject fresh capital, which is again a requirement for our preserving our credit rating. And then secondly, as I mentioned, making sure that we are able to direct our countries, because 40%, as I said, of our target is for our annual volumes to go to climate-related projects. In our countries, they're still building traditional infrastructure that is not necessarily green. So we have to make sure we can take our shareholders along with us to maintain these targets, 30% local currency, 40% climate, and so on.
So the BRICS summit is coming up, and we hear that there are potentially more countries wanting to join the grouping. Would some of them be also potential, members of the bank or investors?
So as you know, as we said earlier on, BRICS is really a combination of the governments of these emerging markets, and the bank is a financial institution where countries subscribe for capital, for equity in the bank, and then they can make loans and so on. At this stage, we only have the 3 new members that have joined, and Uruguay is around to sign, which means we'll have 9 full members of the institution. We're hoping to increase our membership over the next year or two. There's significant emerging markets that have indicated interest to join. Saudi Arabia, for example, has been in the public domain that they're quite keen to join. We are very positive that there's a very strong momentum around the new membership program. And that's because most of these developing countries, they've got this massive need for new infrastructure. They need institutions like ours. Some of them are members of other development banks as well. So we would simply be an additional source of finance, a complementary institution to work alongside these others. Because in scale, we are quite small. The challenge for all of the banks today is to design new methods and ways to crowd in more private sector capital. So one, we will bring in new countries in terms of new membership, and the BRICS Summit will play a critical role in that.
Okay. And where is the challenge in terms of appealing to this international investors? Is it in terms of disclosure, reporting requirements? And
I think there are a number of obstacles, barriers that existed in the past, which is very well captured in this new NDB reform report, which I referenced earlier on. But I'd say if I just capture 3 or 4 of the quick ones, it's difficult for institutional investors to get involved in individual projects. They're not set up to take the risk, project-specific risk. They would much rather take portfolio-level risk. So the first thing we need to do is to move away from, building a solar project and looking for additional institutional investors who could maybe co-invest with us. We should rather do what European Bank for Reconstruction and Development or the IFC have done, where you create portfolio investment platforms. So that's the first one. Secondly, several projects are riskier in the initial phase. So the riskier part of the project, in the initial construction phase of a project, for example, is associated with a higher risk profile. So MDBs can put in place more first loss guarantee structures, for example, where if you come in as Amundi or BlackRock or any other asset manager, you can have recourse to a third party, ourselves or MIGA or another body, where we provide a guarantee. If there are any potential losses, you'll be the first one to absorb those losses. So the second level of risk is associated with us trying to improve the risk return profile, which create a better investment landscape for your institutional investors. Thirdly, I would argue that the absence of what we call a sustainability label. A lot of asset managers want to know explicitly will this project meet ESG criteria? Because their shareholders demand that they have a certain portion of their assets invested in ESG. So there's also been work done in the last few years on creating a sustainability label where you can attest, verifiably attest that this project is green, and that if you put money into this, let's say with the New Development Bank, they will deliver projects that meet all of the highest of environmental standards. These are just some, there's several others, but these are just an example of some of the things that we are doing as an MDB system to attract and mobilize more private sector capital.
Okay. Final questions. What are the key lessons learned since its inception, and how they will inform future priorities?
I would say there's been several. I mean, I've highlighted some of them earlier on. The first one I would say is there's scope to do things differently. There's scope to do things faster and more efficiently. We need to use technology better so that we can fast track speed of execution and deliver on projects, especially infrastructure projects that have long duration. We want to be able to compress the time so that we can do that more efficiently. Secondly, as MDBs, we realize now instead of initiating a project and holding that loan to maturity, we need to not originate and hold, but rather originate and distribute, meaning trying to recycle our capital more. Thirdly, we believe that there's scope to do more local currency financing, which I spoke about early on. There is both, sometimes it can be a more efficient form of financing to finance in local currency. And then fourthly, as I mentioned, the MDBs have to be more catalytic, meaning we should not be looking at financing big projects ourselves, but just take on the riskier parts of the projects, create an environment for institutional investors to co-finance with us. And that, as I said, is the single missing piece right now. We need more ideas, more financial innovation to attract tens of billions of dollars of capital, hundreds of billions of dollars of capital into sustainable infrastructure. So the process of refining, modernizing, and bringing on board new innovations in the MDB world is literally underway. We're by no means clear about what the final model will look like, but these are just some of the lessons we have learned since we founded the bank.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you
Leslie,
very much.
for speaking to us. Great. Thank you.